have not just politics and storytelling, but culture. And we're lucky tonight to have the progeny of the other great Peter of that era, Peter Yarrow's daughter, Bethany, as one half of Bethany and Rufus, and then of course Rufus, the psychic progeny of Jimi Hendrix and Vernon Reid on cello, to form the duo Bethany and Rufus. Please do welcome them for their first musical presentation.
Peter Yarrow is 1/3 of Peter, Paul, and Mary. My dad's on a plane right now down to Selma. And, you know, I don't know if you saw the movie, Selma, but they were like, we got, Harry Belafonte called, and Harry Belafonte actually just called him again and said, Peter, come on down. They got Peter, Paul, and Mary, and he was down on the original march in Selma, and March on Washington in 1963. And so it's a great legacy we all carry forward. And it's a great responsibility, and it's a great privilege to do that. But right now, I'm really thinking about all of those people down in Selma, and the giants who came before, the giants of this movement that the fracking movement has drawn upon, and the Black Lives Matter movement is drawing upon, and it's those giants of the civil rights movement. And that dream is alive. And we are the ones making it live. It lives on in us, in our DNA. And so this is a song, it's an old spiritual. And we're at this point now where we all have to make a choice and figure out where we want to go in the future. And it's a story of radical empowerment that needs to happen. And so if I could teach my 8-year-old daughter anything, I would teach her this song and the freedom that comes with realizing that we each really do have the power to make this change. It's nobody's fault but mine. It's nobody's fault but mine. It's nobody's fault, yes, it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault but mine. And I got a song I can sing. Yes, I've got a song I can sing. But if I fail to sing it and my soul it gets lost, oh well, it's nobody's fault but mine. And I've got a prayer I can pray. Yes, I've got a prayer I can pray. But if I fail to pray it, and my soul it gets lost, oh well, it's nobody's fault but mine. And I've got a God I can serve. Yes, I've got a God I can nobody's fault. Nobody's fault but mine. It's nobody's fault. Yes, it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault but mine. 'Cause I've got my God, and I've got my friend, and I've got my song. Nobody's fault but mine. Oh, but mine. Nobody's fault but mine. Who took this song very literally, decided that she was going to take it on and do it and empower herself to the max, and in doing so, empower all of us. Zephyr Teachout.
It's Bethany's fault, but it's really Albany's fault. And I mean that in the best sense. First of all, thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for having this in this wonderful church. But I will say I often talk about the problems in Albany. I'm not talking about you guys. But as you may know, sort of somewhat against the odds, I'm not the governor of the state of New York, but we did better than any race against an incumbent governor, and won half the counties. But the greatest delight was the 27% victory over Andrew Cuomo in Albany. For a very long time, but he certainly saw and heard from some activists then as well. So it's all your fault, and now we're here to make you make up for it. So this is about, today one of the things we're trying to do is connect poetry and art and politics and power and markets in all these different ways. And I typically try to, bring out a local poet. Am I not loud enough? I can go louder. So earlier today we were near where Edna St. Vincent Millay had lived, and I talked about my candle burns at both ends. It may not last the night, but oh my foes and oh my friends, it's such a lovely sight. That's our energy policy right now in America. But I love William Kennedy, but I thought William Kennedy wasn't really the right poet for the moment. You have extraordinary artists here, but they're all so gloomy. So I want to start with a poet who has meant a lot to me, Audre Lorde, and her discussion about the difference between rhetoric and poetry, which she wrote. This is a poem she wrote. I'm not going to read you the whole poem, just the first line. But she wrote this poem after a young African-American man was shot. A boy was shot by police officers, and looking at the press release response to the shooting. This is, I think, about 20 years ago. And she said the difference between rhetoric and poetry is you kill your children instead of yourselves. But the basic sort of insight there is that we are all so used to a kind of non-poetic politics where everybody's throwing around certain phrases to defend and explain. But if you really want to transform something, you have to engage in the poetic, and that requires some sacrifice of ourselves in a very personal way, whether it's in our language or in our actions or in our time. And I know many of you spend a lot of time. So, but the real poem I'm here to talk about is We Sing the Body Electric, right? My own hometown Walt Whitman. I want to start by saying what I want for New York, and if you're here, you have some vision of what you want. But what I want for New York and for the world is I want people to be able to breathe and drink water and eat safely. I want kids to learn poetry and art in schools and sports. But as far as energy, this is what I want. And I want also for us to be able to eat and drink and breathe safely for other people as well. So that when you are drinking water, some other kid isn't getting poisoned because of it. So most people want this, but they feel a little bit the way they feel about politics, where 96% of Americans think that politics is corrupt, but 91% think there isn't anything we can do about it. So they don't do anything about it because they feel like they're out of touch. I feel like there's a similar thing with renewable energy. I don't know the numbers, but most people think we should have a renewable energy future, sustainable energy future, but they don't think it's possible. But it is possible. And if you have a job tonight, it's to go out and let other people know how possible it is. In Germany last year on June 9th, Germany met over 50% of its electricity needs by solar alone. That's after about a decade of investments, not 50 years of investments. Then there was another day where Germany actually met 75% of its electricity needs by solar alone. And if you're thinking Germany is this balmy, Floridian paradise, it has sort of the solar capacity of Alaska. So we can do this in New York. We don't just want to rely on solar, but if you look at it, there's one Colorado study that said in New York we have basically 1,000% of our current electricity needs could be met by solar alone. 1,000. Yes, 10 times. So that would require covering a lot of different areas. Instead, what we need to do is look at our own possibilities here. We have extraordinary possibilities. We can do a lot. We do have a lot of opportunities with solar. There's 250,000 solar installations in California. I refuse to be beaten out by California. We have 2 million naked rooftops waiting to have solar installed on them right now in New York State, and I can see some naked rooftops out there among some of you. We can start with that, and then we can also really move into geothermal, which is incredibly powerful, and wind, both offshore wind. On the same day that fracking was banned, New York turned down a funded offshore wind plan that would have been actually the jewel in America's crown in terms of offshore wind. I'm stealing your line here, Josh, but it's so good. The reason, of course, that we got a fracking ban is because of you guys. And the reason we didn't get the wind is because we weren't there. There's a political movement behind one and not a political movement behind the other. So we have this, we have this opportunity in New York State, and we of course have this extraordinary history of people doing crazy things that the federal government has refused to do. In the early 19th century, the federal government thought the idea of digging a canal across New York State was so crazy that it was called Clinton's Folly. They didn't know about Hillary Clinton's view on fracking at the time, or Paula Jones, or anybody else. Clinton's Folly was Governor Clinton's belief that we could build the Erie Canal. Bushwhack 363 miles with horses and humans to transform our transportation infrastructure. Within a little over a decade, transportation costs had dropped by 95% because of that. So if we could do that in 1815, we can certainly do that 200 years later and transform our energy infrastructure in New York State, not by 2050, but by 2020, by 2025, and by 2030. Is there. That's the important thing. And the technology is going to keep getting better and pretty rapidly, but already we're not waiting around. We're not sitting waiting for the brilliant ideas to come. We have the solar, we have the geothermal, we have the wind technology right now to power 100% of New York's electricity grid. Okay, so what's our energy system? So why isn't it happening? What should we do about it? I'll tell you the way I think about it. Before I became a law professor, I was an organizer, an online organizer for about 8 years. I was the director of online organizing for Howard Dean's campaign, and then did a lot of work consulting with both nonprofits and community groups on different forms of organizing. And I see basically that there's two real models of modern, powerful organizing. One is one that we're all pretty familiar with. It's where a group develops a very big list, perhaps through petitions, events, big moments, and then tells people on that very big list, this might be Move On, which I love. Yes? you represent both, Susan. You're a complicated person. Best kind of troublemaker. But it's a very big list, and in general then tells people what to do. Go call this congressperson today. Watch this movie tonight. Do this particular thing at this particular time. So it's a form of distributing tasks. So building a big list and distributing tasks. But the decision making is largely at a centralized level. And then there's another form of organizing which is harder, but far more powerful, where power itself is actually decentralized, where the strategy actually happens on the local level. Well, you may still be calling the same congressperson, but you're calling her because you decided that this is part of the local strategic system. And there's an incredible history of this in this country. This is what de Tocqueville saw when he came to explore America, is that no matter what happened, people were always starting clubs, unlike in Europe. If they had an interest in a new bulb, they would start a bulb club. If they had an interest in a new kind of politics or religion, they would start this kind of community, this associational life. And this was so much identified with this country that in 1955, 5% of Americans were presidents of their local voluntary association. Not members, presidents. So this is a culture of citizenship where 1 in 20 people is somebody who can really do something about it if something smells funny in your water. So this is really important because then you are part of, if 1 in 20 people is a president, you're part of a network where when something goes wrong, you can enter that resilient web of citizenship and ask for help. Instead of now when people are so isolated that if something is wrong, they have to wait 4 years to vote. Or wait 2 years until they run into an elected official on the street, but they can't go call their Susan and say, something is funny in the water. This, in fact, in the 1920s, somebody said, we don't need 1920s, we don't need a president, we're a nation of presidents. So my vision is that we become a nation of presidents again. That if 1 in every 20 people takes on the responsibility of presidency, that we can actually transform our political system. So here's the exciting thing, is this is not a vision that you don't understand. This is what I see that you did in banning fracking in New York. Against the National Democratic Party, an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of ignorance, silence on the part of a lot of the big green groups. You built these locally based chapters and organizations with incredible strategy and presidency, and built a structure that was so strong and resilient that every time Andrew Cuomo opened the door, you were sitting there smiling at him with an anti-fracking sign. It's an incredibly powerful story. And whatever happens in the future, I do want you to hold on to this victory that you have, because it was not supposed to happen. You've done this impossible thing. And then I don't know if were any of you involved in any way, even with a comment on the net neutrality fight? Oh my gosh, a lot. Yeah. So now it's been 9 days, and Chairman Wheeler of the FCC announced that we are going to have net neutrality in this country. 2 years ago, I would say, I love Merle Haggard, I just want to go home and listen to Merle Haggard because this kind of thing isn't possible. But you banned fracking and you brought in net neutrality, two entirely impossible things if you look at a power map. and just look at the money and how power is arrayed. And with the net neutrality movement, you saw something similar. You saw people present, like, you guys really did the best bird dogging I have ever seen in my life with the fracking movement. But they also were doing bird dogging. They also had local communities that were then connected to each other. So that's an incredibly powerful form. And I see the task now as, how do we take that form of resistance and turn it into something where we are building? So how do we turn from stopping the water to actually, building the bridge, being architects, being artists, and building this renewable energy future? Because it's not going to happen if we don't do it. It's not going to happen just because the science is there. You guys know that already. It's not going to happen. The bomb trains alone, you think, might make people stop, but we actually have to take those moments and do something with it and build aggressively around it. And one of the reasons I think it's especially important that we use this sort of local organizing model with incredible amount of power and ownership and presidency on the local level is because of what's happening in our politics at large. So what I see is that we're really in a monopoly moment right now. When I was, some of you were there in the early Working Families Party days, and when I agreed with them that I would run for governor, I said, I want to run for governor, but I want to talk about antitrust. And they said, nobody will know what you're talking about. And so we polled on it. This is when we still had a little money. And they were absolutely right. Nobody knew what I was talking about. This fictional woman named Gretchen Woodstock did not poll well on talking about antitrust. But I will tell you, if you get into a room, everybody knows what is happening with concentration of power in the corporate sphere. That there is something very different than business and markets happening with the concentration of power in the banking industry, in the cable industry, with Monsanto, certainly in the fossil fuel industry, and across the board in big data. So everywhere you look, you see this concentration of power and people who feel out of power because of that. I think that's something the Tea Party has done very well, is they've called on people's sense of powerlessness and said, I know why you feel out of power. You feel out of power because government is taking it away from you. And I believe that we can also call on people and say, no, you're right that you're out of power. I want to honor that experience of powerlessness, but it's not because of government. It's actually because of a handful of big companies that are really becoming our governors. So in this monopoly moment of concentrated power, we have to do more than just get to 51% in polling. You actually have to do the bird dogging, you have to do the local organizing, you have to show more power in a different way than just in the good old days when we could rely on, the 51% rule. So, I want to break up big banks and big oil and big coal and tie all these together, because I think that's where our sort of democratic future is. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful and exciting about the potential architecture that we can collectively build is that the vision that I believe we have of the energy future actually fits really well with the decentralized power model. So the fossil fuel industry actually is very well suited to the monopoly moment. The Koch brothers are very well suited to the monopoly moment with their ownership of various sort of points along the chain of the distribution chain. But what's very well suited to a democratic moment is solar, geothermal, small wind, small hydro systems. All of those actually are forms of decentralized power that match the kind of democratic future that we want. And so in that bridge that we're going to build to the future, that future bridge involves decentralized democratic power and decentralized energy power, and they match together so beautifully well. I believe that one of the keys to getting there is not just, this is something that we're talking about, is not just sort of engaging ourselves as organizers, but engaging ourselves as people who buy things. I resist the language of consumer, but people who buy things and people who are part of a market. We saw this in the net neutrality fight, where it was Comcast bought Washington, D.C. The lead lobbyist, Cohen, said, I know we're going to win on the last NBC merger because we've hired everyone. But it wasn't just organizers, there were also companies that had a lot to lose by Comcast's ownership. So Netflix And Etsy and Kickstarter actually played a really important role in being part of an alternative economic vision to the Comcast Time Warner economic vision. And so part of our job, I think, is, along with bringing our morality to bear, is actually starting to build the economic future that we want by supporting those companies that are the solar companies, the geothermal companies, the wind companies that can be a counterweight to the Koch brothers. And just, you'll see later today, but right now, if we don't do anything, we're funding the Koch brothers' billion-dollar takeover of ourselves. And we should be funding the resistance to that on a market level as well as in a political way. So I'm going to end with, again, this is a mashup. I don't know what you call this. I've been mashing up Walt Whitman poems recently. He doesn't have copyright, so. This is a mashup of a Walt Whitman poem about the sun and about democracy. Give me the silent sun with full beams dazzling, and I will make divine magnetic lands. He knew solar power really well. With the divine love of comrades, with the divine love of comrades, I will plant companionship thick as trees along the rivers and the Great Lakes and the plains of America. O free and ecstatic sun, O free and ecstatic democracy. Thank you.
Zephyr Teachout. Yeah. There's no form of energy that can satisfy our emotional needs, except for perhaps music. So let's have Bethany and Rufus come back and take a shot at that.
So I'm here to fulfill your emotional needs. That would be interesting. Tim DeChristopher, who's also a dear friend, he also said, we will be a movement when we sing like a movement. And as my father has always said, you know, he wasn't really interested in music per se. He was interested in changing America. And he saw that the most direct way to do that in the 1960s was through music. And when people sing together, they can do anything. So I'm going to ask you to sing and to think of all those people down in Selma and all of the people who came before us. And this is an old movement song, but I remember singing it in the hallways of Albany with water, bringing it to Cuomo's office, and the police were so moved that they let us through in a different way, so we're so happy to be hearing music and not people screaming at us. It was so nice. So we're going to sing this for our own emotional, spiritual needs. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching for freedom, yeah, freedom, our energy freedom, our political freedom. Sing with us. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching for freedom. You're gonna do better than that if you want to be a ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round,
bad. So